Imagine a small English village hundreds of years ago. The houses are made of wood and mud. The fields stretch out around it. Life is quiet, dictated by the seasons. Then, a man runs out of his hut. He points at another figure disappearing down the muddy track, a stolen piglet squealing under his arm. The man doesn't just curse, he takes a deep breath and yells. This isn't just a random shout of anger. It's a specific, legally recognized alarm. He is raising the hue and cry. The words might vary, but the meaning is clear: stop thief. Everyone who hears it knows what they have to do. By law, they must stop what they are doing. The farmer in the field drops his scythe. The blacksmith leaves his forge. The woman kneading dough wipes her hands and runs outside. They must join the chase. This was the hue and cry. It was the medieval world's emergency broadcast system and its police force, all rolled into one. It was a simple idea. Crime happens. The victim or a witness makes a loud noise, a cry. They might also use a horn to spread the sound farther. The hue referred to the shouting and general uproar that followed. The entire community was then legally obligated to pursue the suspect. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't about being a good neighbor, though that helped. It was a legal duty. The Statute of Winchester, passed in 1285, made this system official law across England. It stated that all men between the ages of 15 and 60 had to be ready to join the chase. If you heard the cry and ignored it, you were in trouble. The community could be fined. You, personally, could be fined or punished. Shrugging your shoulders and going back to work was a crime in itself. The chase was relentless. Once started, it didn't stop at the village boundary. The group of villagers would pursue the suspect as far as they could. If the suspect entered the next village, the pursuers would shout, and that village had to take up the chase. It was like a relay race of justice. The responsibility was passed from one community to the next. The goal was to run the suspect to ground to catch them before they could find a place to hide. What happened if they caught the person? They didn't hold a trial on the spot. The suspect was apprehended and held for the local authority, usually a constable or a reeve. From there, they would face the manor court or a royal justice. The key was catching them red-handed or with the stolen goods. A thief caught with a pig was in a much worse position than a man accused of stealing a pig a week later. The hue and cry was designed for immediate justice, for crimes where the perpetrator was seen. This system was the backbone of law enforcement for centuries. It was born from a time before police officers, before patrol cars, before any organized professional force. Order was not maintained by a man in a uniform. It was maintained by the community itself. The hue and cry was a powerful expression of that idea. It turned every citizen into a potential police officer. It made the entire landscape a potential trap for a criminal. The fields, the woods, the next village over, none of it was safe if the cry was raised behind you. It was a system built on one simple, powerful tool, the human voice, backed by the force of the entire community. To understand why the hue and cry even existed, you have to understand the world it came from. The medieval period was a time without many things we take for granted. There were no streetlights. There were no telephones. And most importantly, there were no police forces. If someone stole from you or attacked you, you couldn't dial an emergency number and wait for help to arrive. Help was already there in the form of your neighbors. Or it wasn't. Medieval society, especially in rural villages, was built on collective responsibility. People depended on each other for everything. They worked together to plant and harvest the fields. They shared a common pasture for their animals. They built the church together. They defended the village together if raiders came. This idea of mutual obligation wasn't just a nice sentiment, it was a survival strategy. An individual alone was vulnerable. A community working together was strong. This collective mindset extended to law and order. Before the hue and cry was even written down in royal statutes, its principles were already at work in systems like the Frank Pledge. This was an old Anglo-Saxon idea. Communities were divided into groups of about 10 households called a tithing. The members of a tithing were all responsible for each other's behavior. If one man in the group committed a crime, the other 9 had to bring him to justice. If they failed, they were all fined. The hue and cry was a natural, more immediate extension of this principle. It took the idea of group responsibility and applied it to the moment a crime was happening. The tithing system was about accountability after the fact. The hue and cry was about action in the heat of the moment. It was a recognition that justice couldn't wait. A thief with a good head start was likely gone forever. The authorities at the time, the king and his lords, relied on this system completely. They didn't have the money or the manpower to create a professional police force to patrol every village in the kingdom. It would have been unthinkable. The king's power was felt through his sheriffs and judges, but they were few and far between. A sheriff might visit a region only a few times a year. For day-to-day peacekeeping, the burden fell on the local community. The hue and cry was a tool the crown gave to the people to police themselves. It was cheap, it was efficient, and it placed the responsibility exactly where it needed to be on the people living in the village. This world was also much smaller and more static than ours. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from the village where they were born. A stranger was immediately noticeable. Their face, their clothes, their accent would all mark them as an outsider. This lack of anonymity was a powerful weapon against crime. If a stranger came to town and a sheep went missing the next day, it wasn't hard to connect the dots. The hue and cry, in this context, wasn't just a chase. It was the community activating its internal alarm system against an outside threat. So the hue and cry wasn't some strange primitive custom. It was a logical solution for its time. It fit perfectly into a society that was small-scale, interdependent, and lacked any central law enforcement. It turned the community's greatest strengths, its local knowledge, its numbers, and its shared interest in keeping the peace, into a functional, if sometimes messy, system of justice. It was a system born of necessity. In a world without police, everyone had to be the police. When it worked, the hue and cry could be incredibly effective. It created a net of citizens that was in some ways more powerful than a modern police force. Its strength came from its immediacy and its intimate local nature. Think about the speed. A crime occurs. A shout goes up. The chase begins instantly. There's no phone call, no dispatch, no travel time for a patrol car. The response is measured in seconds. For a criminal, this was a terrifying prospect. Their window of opportunity to get away was tiny. Before they could get to the edge of the village, they could have a dozen angry people on their heels. The pursuers also had a massive home field advantage. A thief from another town wouldn't know the local landscape. But the villagers did. They knew every shortcut through the woods, every shallow spot in the river, every dead-end alley. They knew which way to run to cut the suspect off. The thief might be running for his life in a straight line, but the community could flow around him, using their collective knowledge to trap him. A man running across an open field is easy prey for people who know that field, like the back of their hand. Then there was the simple power of numbers. One thief, even an armed one, would have a hard time fighting off an entire village. The crowd might only have farm tools, pitchforks, scythes, clubs, but their sheer numbers would be overwhelming. The psychological pressure alone must have been immense. To hear the shouts behind you, to know that every person you see is not a potential bystander but an active enemy, to realize there is nowhere to hide where you won't be recognized and hunted. It was a powerful deterrent. The thought of this public humiliation and inevitable capture would have stopped many crimes before they even started. The system was especially effective for petty, opportunistic crime. Stealing chickens, snatching a purse in the market, grabbing a tool left unattended, these were the sorts of crimes the hue and cry was perfectly designed to stop. They happened in public, they were witnessed, and the culprit was usually not a hardened killer but an ordinary person giving in to temptation or desperation. For them, the sudden, unified wrath of the community was a force they could not withstand. Consider a traveling merchant who was robbed on the road just outside a village. He raises the cry. The villagers pour out. They may not know the merchant, but they know that robbing travelers is bad for business and a threat to their own safety. They have a vested interest in keeping the roads safe. They also know that their village can be fined if they fail to act. So, they chase the robber. The robber, likely on foot, can't outrun a fresh wave of pursuers from every village he passes. He's trapped by the social geography of the landscape. Each village is a new barrier, a new set of eyes and legs joining the hunt. So, in the right context, a small, tight-knit community of visible crime, a clear culprit to hue and cry, was a formidable tool. It turned the entire population into a dragnet. It weaponized local knowledge. It relied on the basic human instinct to protect one's own community. It was a system that could be remarkably efficient, punishing the guilty and reinforcing the social order, all without costing the king a single penny for a policeman's salary. It was the community's net, and for many a medieval thief, it was inescapable. The hue and cry was a good idea in theory. But it was a system run by humans, and that meant it had serious flaws. Its effectiveness depended entirely on the willingness of ordinary people to risk their time, their energy, and sometimes their lives. And people are not always reliable. The system started to break down as soon as the community was not a tight-knit unit. In a large town or a city like London, the hue and cry was far less effective. A thief could steal a purse and disappear into a crowded street in seconds. The shout would be lost in the general noise of the city. People in a city were strangers to one another. They didn't share the same sense of collective responsibility as villagers who had known each other their whole lives. A Londoner hearing a cry down the street might just lock his own door, thinking it wasn't his problem. The anonymity of the city was a criminal's best friend, and the hue and cry's worst enemy. The system also depended on the social standing of the people involved. Imagine a poor farmer accuses a night servant of stealing his crops. The farmer raises the hue and cry. Will the other villagers join in? They might hesitate. Chasing the servant of a powerful man could have serious consequences. The knight might raise their rent, or worse. The law said they had to join the chase, but practicality and self-preservation said to keep your head down. The system was vulnerable to power and influence. A popular or powerful criminal had a much better chance of getting away than a disliked outcast. Likewise, the identity of the victim mattered. If the most respected man in the village was robbed, the entire community would probably leap to his aid. But what if the victim was a beggar, a drunk, or an unpopular newcomer? The response might be lukewarm at best. People might feel the victim deserved it, or they might simply not care enough to get involved. The community was not always a single, unified body. It was full of its own prejudices, grudges, and social divisions. There was also the simple element of danger. The law expected an unarmed farmer to chase down a potentially desperate and armed criminal. A thief running for his life is a dangerous person. He might be carrying a knife or a club. Confronting him was a real risk. Many people would have done a cost-benefit analysis in their heads. Is it worth getting stabbed to recover my neighbor's stolen pot? For many, the answer would be no. They might make a show of joining the chase, but they would hang back, letting the more enthusiastic or foolhardy take the lead. The system was also open to abuse. A personal dispute could easily be turned into a public hunt. If two men were rivals, one could falsely accuse the other of theft and raise the hue and cry. The accused would then have the whole village chasing him, and he would have a very hard time explaining his innocence while running for his life. The hue and cry was a blunt instrument. It assumed the person running was guilty. There was little room for nuance or investigation in the heat of the moment, and sometimes the chase just failed. The criminal was too fast. He had a horse. He knew the woods better than the villagers. The trail went cold, night fell, the villagers, tired and frustrated, would eventually give up and return to their homes. The system had no dedicated investigators or detectives. Once the initial pursuit failed, there was often no follow-up. The criminal was simply gone. Court records from the period are full of cases where the hue and cry was raised, but the suspect escaped. It was far from a foolproof system. Its strengths in a small village were its greatest weaknesses in any other context. It relied on a social cohesion that was often fragile and on a level of civic courage that was often lacking. The hue and cry didn't disappear overnight. It faded away slowly as the world that created it changed. For centuries, it was the main way of keeping the peace. But society grew more complex, and the old system couldn't keep up. The growth of towns and cities was a major factor. As more people moved from the countryside into urban centers, the close-knit communities that made the hue and cry work began to dissolve. A city ward was not the same as a village. Your neighbors were strangers. The collective spirit was replaced by a more individualistic one. A shout for help in a crowded market was more likely to be ignored than acted upon. The system was designed for a world of familiar faces, not a world of anonymous crowds. At the same time, the nature of government was changing. The state began to take a more active role in day-to-day life, including law enforcement. The old idea of collective responsibility was gradually replaced by the idea of designated authority. Communities started to appoint people to specific roles, like the parish constable. At first, this was an unpaid and often unwanted job forced upon a citizen for a year. The constable was responsible for raising the hue and cry, but he was also assigned that peacekeeping was becoming a specialized task, not a job for everyone. Over time, these roles became more formal. Towns organized night watchmen to patrol for fires and criminals. While often portrayed as old and incompetent, they represented another step away from the communal system. People were beginning to expect a designated person to handle trouble. They were less inclined to do it themselves. Why run after a thief when that's what the watchman is supposed to do? By the 18th century, with the Industrial Revolution looming, the hue and cry was mostly a relic. Huge cities like London were dealing with organized crime, professional thieves, and widespread social unrest. A spontaneous citizen chase was completely inadequate for this new reality. The problems were too big, too organized, and too dangerous for amateurs. This led to experiments like the Bow Street Runners in London, a small group of paid professional thief-takers. They were a forerunner of the modern detective. The final end for the hue and cry came in the 19th century. In 1829, Sir Robert Peel established the Metropolitan Police Force in London. This was a radical idea, a large, uniformed, professional body of men paid by the state to prevent crime and pursue criminals. It was the birth of modern policing. The idea spread quickly. Cities and towns across the country established their own police forces. With the arrival of the police officer of the body, the legal duty of the ordinary citizen to join the hue and cry became obsolete. It remained on the law books for a long time, a ghost of a previous age, but it was no longer practiced. The responsibility for law enforcement had been transferred from the community to the state. The shout was replaced by a whistle, and the chase on foot was replaced by the methodical work of a uniformed officer. So, what was the effectiveness of the medieval hue and cry? The answer is that it was effective for its time and place. In a small, rural, unstable society, it was a clever and cost-effective system. It leveraged community pressure and local knowledge to maintain a basic level of order. It was a system perfectly matched to the society it served, but it was not a perfect system. It was prone to failure, prejudice, and fear, and it could not adapt. As society became more urban, more mobile, and more anonymous, the hue and cry became hopelessly outdated. Its effectiveness was tied to a world that was disappearing. Its legacy is a reminder that systems of justice are not timeless. They are products of their environment, and when the environment changes, they must change too. The journey from a village shout to a police officer's badge was a long one, and it marked the end of an era when keeping the peace was everyone's job.